it doesn't answer the more fundamental question of why is there this chain at all. That's one of the actual benefits of the argument from contingency, is that it doesn't argue or assume that the universe began to exist. So in essence, the universe could be eternal. There could be an infinite regress of causes that stretch back forever. But the point is that that doesn't explain why that contingent series, that infinite causal series, exists.
I'm super excited to have my next guest on his YouTube channel. Is Capturing Christianity, the website capturingchristianity.com, the Facebook page Capturing Christianity, Twitter is Capturing Christ, no Ianity there, and you can support him on...
It's patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Pretty simple.
Awesome. All right, everybody head on over there to support him. Karen Bertuzzi, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we've been working on putting this together for a while now. So glad we're finally doing it.
Yeah.
One of the things you're more known for, I think, is the contingency argument. You've discussed a lot on your channel. You've had guests on to talk about it. Obviously, you're good friends with Josh Rasmussen, who's done a lot of work on it. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, mainly like how you became a Christian and ultimately like how you got interested in apologetics.
Yeah, so those are two different questions. I'll take the first one. So I was always a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home. My parents, we always went to church. We actually grew up in the charismatic movement, so that's kind of interesting. But so I've always sort of been a Christian. There's been a period where I had some pretty serious doubts, actually not too long ago, a couple years ago, but that didn't last very long. So I would say I've just sort of always been a Christian just because I was sort of born into it. But the reason why I think I'm still a Christian is because, in large part, due to apologetics and philosophy of religion more specifically. So that's something to, I guess, point out, keep in mind, is that it's not just that I was sort of indoctrinated into Christianity. After I started to look at some of the objections that my brother raised, he became an atheist about 7 to 8 years ago at this point. Once I started to look into some of the objections that he raised to Christianity, it wasn't just that I was able to rest on my tradition or how I grew up. That wasn't enough to remain a Christian, basically. And so it was through apologetics and philosophy that I learned that there are good answers and responses to a lot of the objections that he raised. And there's good reasons and evidence and arguments to think that God exists and that Christianity is true. And we'll discuss one of those today, the argument from contingency, which is my favorite argument, all-time favorite argument. I mean, the best argument is always the one from all of the arguments. I mean, that's almost like a cop-out. It's like, if you're going to... But anyway, so that's my favorite argument. And so what got me into apologetics, I've already sort of touched on it briefly, was my brother. He came out as an atheist a little under a decade ago. And it was right after my wife and I got married. And it kind of took me by surprise. I wasn't prepared or thinking that was going to happen at all, but my brother-in-law gave me a call and was like, hey, look, we got to talk about something serious. And it turns out that my brother was falling away from the faith very rapidly. And so I met with him, and that first conversation I had with him did not go well, for lots of different reasons. Partly because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know apologetics. I wasn't taking his skepticism seriously. I wasn't taking his objections seriously. And so it was just not a good meeting. But after that point, it plunged me into apologetics, and I learned a lot more about philosophy. And I learned the reasons that theologians and Christians have given over the centuries, the millennia, actually. And once I started to investigate and ask, well, are these good reasons, or is this good evidence? I don't want to just believe something just because that's what I grew up believing. And after a while, I became convinced that there are actually good reasons to think that God exists and that Christianity is true. But that's how I got into it. It sort of started all by my brother falling away from the faith, and that causing me to really investigate my own faith and discover whether or not there were good reasons to think that Christianity is true.
Yeah, and that's like me. I always tell people I was raised Christian, but I wasn't indoctrinated. Like I came, especially in my teenage years, I had a lot of doubts, especially like suffering from depression and all that kind of stuff. And then apologetics.
Sorry to hear that.
No, well, it's okay. I mean, I'm working on it. I appreciate it.
Yep.
But like, for me, like, just the intellectual study of the problem of evil really kind of gave me a humility to kind of put that in perspective and, be able to work through a lot of that stuff. And it's funny, I actually, most of my siblings, I think, are skeptics. They take various forms of skeptics. I remember, like, my younger brother, I didn't even know he was a skeptic. And what was funny is he would be in the room all the time when I was watching William Lane Craig debates and studying apologetics, and he knew I was talking about it all the time, and I think I just took for granted, because we both had a similar upbringing, that he was a Christian. When it kind of came out that he wasn't, I was shocked, and I didn't even really know what to say to him, because he knew, like, what I studied and what I did, and he had seen a lot of the evidence. And so, yeah, it's harder with family for some reason. So I like what you mentioned earlier there, though. On another note, you said the best arguments from all the arguments. It always cracks me up, and I know you've talked about this, when skeptics just say, well, there's just no evidence for God. It's like, well, you might not be convinced, but there's not no evidence for God. Like, have you looked at all the development starting in Greece to now? Like, it's quite sophisticated.
Yeah, I have a book on my desk called 24 Arguments or So for God's Existence. This was actually published not too long ago, I think in the summer of 2019. And it features exactly what it says. There's about 24, a little over 24 arguments for God's existence by different authors, by different philosophers, different Christian thinkers. And yeah, I mean, so the claim that there's no evidence for God is just, it's obviously false for anyone who actually knows what they're talking about, or knows the dialectic at all. There's obviously evidence for God. The question is rather, is this good evidence? Is it sufficient evidence to believe that God exists, or is it just sort of moderate or not any good, or maybe even misleading? Some evidence can be misleading. So that's the real question, is whether, like, the quality of the evidence. That's the only question. It's not whether there is any evidence.
Right. Yeah, and you addressed that question in your recent video you did about, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name. I know his name. Dr. Tyson. Am I saying?
Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson. Can't believe I forgot that name. That's a great video. I highly recommend everybody check that video out. Actually, I'll just put a link to it in the description. So today we're going to be talking about the contingency argument. Now, I guess briefly, just to open up, like, some people may have never heard that. They're like, well, what does that mean? I've never contingency. What's this? Some fancy schmancy nonsensical thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer is yes. It's nonsense. No. So the argument from contingency is, like, it's actually one of the most fundamental questions that you can ask about anything, I think. And I've thought about this, like, in my own life and upbringing. It didn't have anything to do with apologetics, but everybody, I think, wonders at some point, like, why does anything exist? Why is there a universe at all? Why do humans look the way that they look? Why does any of this stuff exist? And so this question is basically about why there is anything. Why is there something rather than nothing, is like the more famous way of putting it. And so the contingency argument is basically an argument for God's existence based on the fact that something exists, and that something, that particular something, is contingent things. So it might be a good place to pause real quick and just get a better understanding of what contingency means. And so in this context, there's kind of two ways to understand it. The first way is something is contingent if it can fail to exist, or if it's not necessary. So take pretty much everything that you are looking at is contingent. Anything on your desk, your phone, if you're watching this on a phone. My mug is a contingent thing because it could fail to exist. It hasn't always been here. I could throw it on the ground and smash it. So that's what a contingent thing is something that can fail to exist in some way. And there's another understanding of contingent, which is more like, well, it's just a different understanding. Most people, if you're not familiar with philosophy, this is probably the definition that you were thinking of when you heard contingent, is dependence. So something depends on something else for its existence. That's another way of understanding contingency. But the argument that I use, and we'll be talking about today, uses that first definition, where anything that is contingent can fail to exist. So, and there are contingency arguments, ones that I like, ones that I think that are sound, based on this other definition or other understanding, which is the more dependence understanding. But those are some terms that you need to know going into the argument. So It's asking the most basic question you can ask about reality, which is, why is there anything at all? And the answer, what this tries to do, what this argument tries to do, is show that, well, there is something because God exists, basically, and he's the reason why all contingent reality that we're familiar with exists. So that's the basic broad outstrokes. I don't know if that's a term. That's what the argument does and tries to do.
Yeah. So I wanted to real quick read the premises for the argument formally, and then kind of maybe just give slight pushback on each one so we can get just a little bit of a defense. And I got this for one of your videos. So premise one: for any contingent thing or group of contingent things, there's an explanation of the fact it or they exist. 2. Considering all the contingent things that exist, if there is an explanation of those things, there is a necessary part of reality. 3. So there is a necessary part of reality. 4. If there is a necessary part of reality, then God exists. 5. So God exists. So I guess starting with premise 1, for any contingent thing or group of contingent things, there's an explanation of the fact it or they exist. Well, you kind of just outlined it there, that it can fail to exist. It has potential in that sense, but it doesn't have to exist, or even if it's dependent. I have heard some people say, some atheists say, well, contingency, it's really just a kind of a word we use to describe cause and effect in the universe, and so it's not really fair to use it to claim something that can fail to exist or dependent, because that begs the very question of the contingency argument, which says it would apply to the universe as a whole instead of just describing cause and effect in the universe.
So clarify that for me real quick. But because it sounded like you were raising two separate objections. What's the objection here?
Basically, and I'm not saying it's a good objection, but I've heard it said
that
contingency is essentially a made-up word to describe cause and effect in the universe. But
okay, let's pause there. Let's talk about that real quick. So, in one sense, to quote Thor from Infinity War, all words are made up. You know, it's just the fact that we use language in this way. And so what's happening when we're talking about contingent things is we're looking at different objects that we're familiar with in our everyday lives. We're saying, well, this object has this property, and that property can fail to exist. And so all we're doing is we're slapping a name on that and saying, well, then that thing is contingent because it has this property. So it's really just a sort of semantic thing at that point. And another thing to point out is that the argument or the concept of contingency isn't actually about cause and effect. It's really about whether something could fail to exist. So glass cups, I don't have a glass cup on my table, but glass cups can fail to exist. So, or sort of by definition, the way that we're using these words, glass cups are contingent because we know that they can fail to exist. So anything that you know of that can fail to exist is just what we're talking about when we say contingent. So when you say that this is like a made-up thing, well, in a sense, yeah, but all we're doing is we're looking at the property that something actually has. Like this cup actually has the property, it can fail to exist because I know that I can smash it and it can go out of existence, so it can fail to exist. And then we're just slapping a name on that saying, well, that means that it's contingent. It has the property of contingency. So that's the first thing to say. Now, you said something else, though, that...
Yeah, well, I was saying...
But unless you want to comment there.
No, that's great. I was just thinking because in my head I'm always like thinking devil's advocate questions, right? So in my mind, what I see like the skeptic, what he's raising by saying contingency is just a word we use to describe cause and effect in the universe, is they're kind of accusing you of building into the argument kind of this assumption that if there's contingent things in the universe, then that's going to make the universe as a whole contingent. When we know that skeptics all like to say all the time that the universe can be a brute fact, or it can be eternal, or it can be the uncaused caused. And so maybe the accusation here is you're kind of just making this assumption that if there are contingent things in the universe, then the universe as a whole is going to be contingent.
Okay. Yeah, so when I hear objections like this, the first thing that I like to do most often is try to pinpoint like what premise of my argument are they trying to take aim at. And so with this objection, it's saying something like, well, how do we know that the universe as a whole is contingent? Because all we're doing is we're looking at individual things in the universe that are contingent. Where if you look back at my argument, and I don't know if you have it on the screen or whatever, I can just read it back out here. The first premise says, for any contingent thing or group of things, there is an explanation of the fact that it or they exists. So this objection doesn't really seem like it's targeting that premise. But then premise 2 is, considering all the contingent things that exist, if there's an explanation for those things, there is a necessary foundation. And I kind of changed up the terminology here just at the last part.
Yeah.
But so it doesn't seem like we're actually targeting either premise with this objection. And so basically what it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it sounds like this is just sort of a red herring, or maybe it's just a confused objection that doesn't really deal with the argument that I gave. And so that's why it's important when you're talking about an argument for God's existence. Like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different versions of these arguments. And so you can't raise an objection and just sort of assume that it applies. You've got to make sure that the version that the person is articulating actually is susceptible to this objection. And so it doesn't seem to me, at least at face value, that either premise in the argument, the first two premises at least, it doesn't seem like it targets either of those, and so it's not really an objection at all. We could even say, well, okay, that's fine, but the first two premises are true, the third one follows, and then the question is whether or not the fourth premise is true, which the conclusion, the fifth step in the argument would just sort of logically follow. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that skeptics do like to do, and of course I'm kind of half putting myself in that mindset and half not, but it is that they'll kind of just say certain things that sound compelling or sound convincing, and then it's like, okay, but is it really challenging a specific premise? It's like, well, no. It's like, okay, well, so you got to be more clear than that. You got to try to put this in a more logically consistent way.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we'll get more into the cosmic skeptic debate you had earlier, but one of the things he accused you of, and I guess this might be kind of along the lines of what we were just talking about, was if you're saying that there's any contingent thing or a group of contingent things, right? And maybe you're trying to be more modest by not just assuming everything is contingent, but just saying, well, at least if there's something that is contingent. What you're actually doing is you're presupposing there's necessary things, because that would be the only other category other than contingent. And maybe the skeptic wants to argue that there isn't any necessary things. Maybe if there's only contingent things all the way down to the bottom, maybe there's an infinite regress. So maybe how would you respond to the kind of infinite regress argument here?
Yeah, so
I
would just say
premise too, by the way.
Right, yeah, so this would be a rejection of the conclusion of the argument, but it's not necessarily a rejection of either premise. So the first conclusion of the argument is that there is a necessary foundation. So that's the conclusion. But then you've got to look at for the two premises and see, well, are the two premises true? Because if they are, then the first conclusion of the argument follows deductively. So it's not enough to just disagree with the conclusion. You've got to disagree with the premises or the steps of the argument.
Well, so then maybe I can put it forward in that way, that the skeptic in this case is rejecting premise 2 by saying, well, if there is an explanation of contingent things, we don't need to appeal to a necessary thing if we have an infinite regress of contingent things.
I see, I gotcha. Okay, so one thing that I would say on the infinite regress objection is that when you're appealing to an infinite series, you're not actually explaining the series itself. You're just positing more and more things that go back into the past. So in other words, in order to explain sort of infinite regress, we have to look at something that is outside of the regress. So let's bring it back to reality, use a concrete example. So suppose that we're thinking about an infinite chain of chickens causing more and more chickens to exist. And so the question that we would be asking is, why does the entire chain, why does the infinite regress itself exist? Why is there this infinite regress of chickens? Why couldn't it be an infinite regress of turtles or books or anything else? And so it doesn't answer the more fundamental question of why is there this chain at all. That's one of the actual benefits of the argument from contingency, is that it doesn't argue or assume that the universe began to exist. So in essence, the universe could be eternal. There could be an infinite regress of causes that stretch back forever. But the point is that doesn't explain why that contingent series, that infinite causal series, exists. And so even though we'd have an infinite regress of causes, the entire series or the entire set would be contingent, and it would still need an explanation. So that's the primary thing that I would say in response to that, to the infinite regress objection.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's great, and that was in Joshua Asmussen's book too, How Reason Can Lead to God. I highly recommend everybody I picked it up. I just bought it for a friend of mine because they're more skeptical, and I was like, I got the perfect book for you.
Yeah.
So good. So yeah, I think that's a good defense, kind of as an introductory level of 1 and 2, and then we get to 3. So there's a necessary part of reality, which logically follows if both those premises are true. So now we move to 4. If there's a necessary part of reality, then God exists. And here the skeptic might say, whoa, slow your roll there, son. Why couldn't the universe be the uncaused cause? Why does it just need to, or the universe, if it's the uncaused cause, it could just be necessary. The entire universe as a whole. Why do we need God?
Right. Yeah. So this is another word that skeptics use for this objection is called the gap problem. And so this is why I actually like to split the argument from contingency into 2 stages. So the first stage is about explaining contingent things. So remember, for any contingent thing or group of things, there's an explanation of the fact that it or they exist. That's premise 1. Premise 2 is considering all the contingent things that exist. If there's an explanation for those things, there's a necessary foundation. And then the third thing just follows logically, deductively, so there's a necessary foundation. So that's stage 1. And so what again, when I hear these types of objections from atheists, the first thing I always do is put it in its right place. Like, what premise is this attacking? And you already said at the beginning, but I'm just sort of giving an illustration of how the reasoning might go. If you encounter this, any Christians watching or anyone who likes the argument and defends it, this is the sort of thing to do. And this isn't necessarily about defending the argument. It's just about seeking truth. We want to seek truth here. It has nothing to do with just defending this argument. If the argument is no good, I want to know. All I care about in this situation is the truth. So it's not about defending something that I already previously believe, which I think is something to look out for, because some people do that. Some people look for arguments that sort of confirm what they already want to believe.
Yeah.
But anyways, so let me get back to the point. So the point is that you want to see where in the argument this objection is targeting. And so it clearly targets stage 2. And I mentioned that it's called the gap problem in the literature. So there's a lot of different arguments. When you look at Alex Bruce, Josh Rasmussen has a paper from A Necessary Being to God. And there's a lot of different ways that philosophers over the centuries have tried to argue that this necessary foundation of reality has got to be God. It's got to have some divine attributes. And so I think that this is actually, to step back a second, I think this is probably the best objection to the argument from contingency. So even someone like Graham Oppy, who's an atheist professor out of Australia, he's like probably the most, a lot of even Christian philosophers like William Lane Craig will recognize that Graham Oppy is like, he's the smartest atheist alive right now. He's really smart. And so what he does, interestingly enough, he accepts the first stage of the argument, which to me is actually progress in philosophy. If most people are starting to accept stage 1 now, that's actually progress. That's great news. We should celebrate that. But what he does is he rejects stage 2. So he doesn't think that the necessary foundation has to be God. It could just be the universe in some sense. And so I've found there's basically 2 ways that philosophers have defended stage 2. This premise that if there is a necessary foundation, then God exists. The 2 different methods that I've found, the first method is to basically just introduce more evidence into the equation. So instead of just looking at contingent things, we can introduce something like the argument from fine-tuning, which looks at the initial conditions of the universe and says, well, actually, the universe is fine-tuned for life to exist, and so really the best explanation for fine-tuning of why a life-permitting universe exists is that it was designed to permit life. It was designed to, allow life to evolve. And so that's the first way, is basically to introduce more evidence. And Josh Rasmussen, who you've mentioned already, and who I've had on my channel, he introduces, that's what he does in his book, How Reason Can Lead to God, is he basically goes through a bunch of different lines of evidence, including morality and consciousness. And I don't know if he actually references fine-tuning. He does in a different book. But there's a bunch of different routes that you can go. So one route is to just sort of leave the contingency argument alone for a second and just say, well, then let's just bring in more evidence. Let's just bring in consciousness and morality and all the evidence. Let's look at all the evidence and see what we can glean from all of it. And the next thing that you can do, the second type of argument that you could give, that the foundation of reality, the necessary part of reality must be God, is you can just analyze it. You can just analyze the necessary foundation and try to come up with the best, least arbitrary, simplest account of the foundation of reality. And so following Rasmussen again, this is one of my favorite things that he argues, is that his account, which he calls a supreme being hypothesis, I just call it perfect, like it's a perfect being or a perfect hypothesis. That is like the least arbitrary, it's the best hypothesis you can think up, because what it does, the benefit of this hypothesis is that it shaves away any kind of arbitrary limits that you might have to build in to a different type of hypothesis. So for example, suppose that this necessary foundation is just the universe, and one of the first questions that we want to ask is, well, what can this thing do? How much power does it have? And so if the person says, well, it has the power to create 20 different bubble universes, the question then arises, well, why does it have only that much power? This seems like an arbitrary limit in what it can do.
Why not 21? Why not 22? Why not 18?
Exactly. And so anything that is less than perfect, any hypothesis that you can come up with for the necessary foundation of reality, any hypothesis that you come up with that is less than perfect is going to have some of these arbitrary properties just sort of built in. And what that raises is this problem of, well, actually limits cry out for an explanation. Everything that we know of that has a limit has an explanation for that limit. The fact that this mug can only hold, I think it's 11 ounces of water, that's a limit. And that limit is explained by the fact that it was built this way. Everything, like my computer, has a certain limit in what it can do, and there's a reason for that. There's an explanation for that. But when we're talking about the foundation of reality, there literally can't be an explanation outside of the foundation. It's impossible. But if that's true, if we can't explain the necessary part of reality, then the necessary part of reality basically has to be limitless. It has to be unlimited. It has to be perfect. So those are the two ways that I think are pretty plausible candidates for arguing, closing the gap, so to speak, between just this necessary foundation that could be the universe to this is actually God. This is an unlimited being that has unlimited value, unlimited power, unlimited goodness, unlimited knowledge. Like that's what this thing has to be. It's the least arbitrary. It's the best account. And so that's what I'm convinced. I'm pretty convinced by his arguments for that.
Yeah, as am I. However, I'm just going to, again, playing devil's advocate, raise objection.
Yeah, go for it.
So somebody might say, okay, so we have this necessary kind of foundation of reality that can't cease to exist, but why introduce personhood into it? So for example, you talk about all powerful things, but then you said all goodness, and it's like all of a sudden we introduce a personal aspect. Why does this necessary foundation have to be a person rather than some maybe eternal necessary nature, kind of a Tom Jump type of argument, which our contingent universe arises from that more primary necessary universe?
Yeah, so the objection is, why does it have to be a person? And this is basically just a variation of the previous one. Why can't the necessary foundation just be the universe? Which is another way of saying, why can't it be a non-person? Why can't it be just something that's moderately powerful, can do some stuff, but is not a person? So we don't have to adopt theism, basically.
Well, even it's kind of going below that, and it's saying, okay, well, of course, the universe we observe is, for any reasonable conclusions, contingent, but maybe there's even another universe under that that's eternal and necessary, that's not limited in power, but just you can just remove all the personal attributes.
Yeah. So I think with that hypothesis, we wouldn't be solving the problem, because that thing, we'd have to ask the question, is it necessary or is it contingent? And then if it is contingent, we run into the same problem. There's got to be some sort of necessary foundation that explains that. And so we've got to get to the ground level, because again, separating the two different stages here. The first stage is about getting to that necessary foundation, and then the second stage is about analyzing or asking, what kind of properties does this foundation have? So, well, let's get back to the objection, which is basically that maybe it's why do we have to assert personhood? So there's two things, and basically I'm just going to sort of rehash what I've already said, but I'm going to do it in a different way. So the first thing to say is that if we go the route of introducing more evidence, like the fine-tuning argument, a design hypothesis automatically includes personhood. Like you're automatically including intentions in the design plan, and that has to include someone who's a person. If you have a designer, then that's a person, basically. So if we go that route of looking at more evidence, consciousness would be another one. So if the foundation the necessary foundation is conscious, and that explains why there are conscious beings, for example, then obviously we have a person who is conscious. So that route solves the problem. But if we're looking back at the second route, the second route was just to analyze the nature of the foundation by itself, do that sort of a separate issue, which I think we should probably do both. If we're being honest, we should do both. We should look at all of the evidence and we should analyze the foundation. But I think both of them work perfect together. But so let's just look at the second one. And so what Josh argues in his work is that something that is non-personal is going to be less valuable than something that is personal. And so in the same way that we need some sort of explanation for limits in power, we need an explanation for a limit in value. And so if something is limited to the nth degree, why isn't it a little bit more valuable? Why is it only that valuable? So just like we were saying, why can it only create 20 universes? Why can't it create 25 universes? They say, why is it only this valuable? Why couldn't it be more valuable? And so basically the same exact objection or the same response applies here if we think that value is a real property and that limits need an explanation. So the same exact thing would follow, but it requires a little bit more because we're looking at value instead of just power and that sort of thing. So it's basically the same type of response, but just a little bit more pointed in getting to a person.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And then I guess the last objection along these lines before we get into the debate that you had with Alex O'Connor on Unbelievable was, and Maxwell Yates had raised this objection to Trent Doherty because they debated the contingency argument. And essentially he was saying that for all we know, the universe could, if you grant, say, a B theory of time, right, and then you already have the universe as eternal, why can't you include necessity in that? And Trent Doherty came back and said, and I forget if he said squared or cubed law, but he said, well, gravity follows a squared law, or he might have said cubed, right? And he said, well, why does it follow that law instead of an inverse, different kind of law? So you have contingency right there in that gravity follows one law, and then that's kind of arbitrary instead of following a different law. And Maxwell Yates said, yeah, but you already grant, for example, that if we're talking about possible universes, right, that there's no possible universe in which 2 + 2 = 5. Right, because we recognize that there's something about logic that's kind of necessary, and mathematics that applies applying any given possible universe. How do we know that it's not like that for gravity? And if it's like that for gravity, it could be like that for all the fine-tuning things, that at bottom there is some kind of necessary thing that we just don't know about it yet.
So is this an objection to the fine-tuning argument or the contingency argument?
It was an objection to the contingency argument. In the context, they were actually discussing both. But
okay, because I haven't watched that. I don't know what Trent was arguing, so I'm not really sure.
Okay, no, that's fair.
What you're getting at here, yeah.
I mean, I think Maxwell Yates was kind of just grasping at straws, because Trent Doherty had granted there's no possible universe in which 2 + 2 = 5. So then Maxwell Yates was saying, well, how do we know it's not also the case that there's no possible universe in which gravity doesn't follow an inverse squared law rather than an inverse cubed law? So you're claiming about contingency, it seems that things could have been another way, but maybe they couldn't have.
Okay, so would Maxwell Yates say that this cup is a necessary thing?
For all we know.
For all we know. So would Maxwell agree that he was alive during the Jurassic period?
Oh, see, now we're already getting into the cosmic skeptic thing. Because, yeah, it's starting, so you have a baseline. He's granting there's kind of this necessary thing at the Big Bang that essentially determines what all the fine-tuning conditions are going to be. But then he's kind of appealing to the Alex O'Connor objection to say, well, if things are determined, then they're not contingent.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so that doesn't follow. That everything, so if things are determined, then they're not contingent. So there's a couple things to say. So the first thing to say is that if everything is necessary, then we're already done with stage 1 and we can just look at stage 2. So if you already want to grant that there's a necessary foundation, that's great. We can actually just then look at stage 2. And so we basically do the exact same thing I just did, or talked about, where we can look at additional evidence or we can analyze the foundation. So those are 2 things that you could do. I just lost my train of thought, so you're gonna have to pick up.
It's okay. Well, so I mean that's perfect to move right into, because one of the things Alex O'Connor was raising, and it seemed like I don't know why he wasn't getting this distinction. I think he was harping on your description of contingency things as could have failed to exist, right?
Hmm.
And he's saying essentially, well, if my birth is determined, like if we grant a determined type of universe, if my birth is determined, it couldn't have failed to. I couldn't have failed to exist, right?
Right.
Because it was determined to happen. But I think that's missing the definition. So maybe you could kind of clarify where he's missing the definition
Right.
there.
Right, yeah. So by could fail to exist, that also applies in worlds where determinism is true. So, and that's why I gave the example of my mug and you or Maxwell. I was saying, has Maxwell always existed? Did Maxwell exist in the Jurassic period? If the answer is no, and obviously Maxwell Yates, well, this fictional character existed now, but if he didn't exist in the Jurassic period, then he could fail to exist, even on this deterministic, if the universe is deterministic. So it's a confusion, and I kind of get it. I understand why the confusion happens. But so the point is that even on determinism, things come in and go out of existence.
Yeah.
So that's the real point, is that even on determinism, if I'm determined to smash this mug, then this mug is still contingent because it went out of existence, even on determinism.
Yeah, so do you think it would be a fair clarification when we're talking about things that could fail to exist, or rather, if we're describing something that's necessarily existent, that implies at all times and in all places?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because I think
For
that would
necessary.
help, because what he's saying is, well, if couldn't have failed to exist, he's picking a specific given point in time and saying at this point in time it couldn't have failed to exist if we grant determinism. But of course, necessity means at any given time. So like 100 years ago or 100 years from now, I don't exist anymore. And so I'm not necessary because I don't take up any given time and space. Um,
Well, I would say to go a step further, he doesn't know that even if we grant everything that he has to say about it and say that if it's determined and it exists now, then it can't fail to exist. That's not obviously true to me. So for example, suppose that God exists and that God is holding everything into being. So God could just snap this out of existence even if determinism is true. Like it doesn't follow that this thing has to exist just because it exists now and determinism is true. So
yeah.
that any inference that he's making on that seems to me to just be flawed. Like it doesn't follow.
Yeah. Well, and that gets into something I was just thinking, because even on determinism, the problem with just because something's determined doesn't mean it's not contingent. Even if you go back to the Big Bang, because prior to the Big Bang, like say even on a naturalistic view, there was nothing that determined the Big Bang had to be the way it was. The Big Bang just happens, and then you can say after that determinism follows, like once you have these initial conditions that explode, everything else after that's going to be determined, but there was nothing that preceded the Big Bang to determine it would be the way it is. So you can only really even have determinism after the Big Bang. But so then all the conditions of the Big Bang and what the Big Bang would later determine is contingent upon something else. Because he talked about the fallacy of composition, right? And I think we've kind of already addressed this in our defense of the first and second premise. But there's this idea, he said, like, well, the example he gave during the debate was like every sheep in the herd has a mother, therefore the entire herd has a mother, and that's obviously false, right? Now, it's not obviously false, right, because maybe they're all siblings, but we can ignore that. This is one of the things that really helped me when I read Josh Rasmussen's book, was you have to, when we're talking about the quote-unquote fallacy of composition, you have to ask, well, are the initial building blocks there capable of building the aggregate? Because if you don't have the right materials in the building blocks, and then you get the aggregate, then you're going to have the fallacy of composition. But that's not always the case. So the very fact that every sheep in a herd would be contingent upon a parent sheep would apply to the whole group, right? So it actually matters if the building blocks there are necessary. So for example, like you might say, well, each tile to build a floor weighs 1 pound, therefore the entire tile weighs 1 pound. That's obviously a fallacy, but with the right building block there is weight. There's weight. That's the fundamental building block that is represented in the building blocks and then in the final product. So there's no fallacy to say because the weight is contained here, then weight will be contained here. I'm kind of rambling at this point because some of my thoughts are being jumbled up, but maybe you could help clarify.
Yeah, no. So the fallacy in composition is about inferring a property of the whole from the fact that a property of one of the parts has this specific property. So a common example that I've seen is it's a fallacy to conclude that because every part of an elephant is light in weight, therefore the whole elephant is light in weight. But it's not a fallacy to argue this way. Every brick is red, therefore the wall of bricks is red, right? That's not necessarily a fallacy. So it's not always the case that fallacy of composition, that inferring from parts to wholes is fallacious. It's not always the case. It really depends on the property. And so what we could do is, in the case of like color, we can see pretty clearly if we have an example of parts to wholes, a kind of inference like that works, then we can see in other cases it's going to work just the same. So when we were talking about red bricks and a brick wall that's made of red bricks, the whole wall is going to be red. And so when it comes to other things that are colored, this whole table, each part is brown, therefore the whole table will be brown, right? And so in cases where we can identify this property that a part has that the whole is going to share as well, then we can apply that in other cases. So here's one way to do it when it comes to explanation is if we think about one camera, every camera that we know of has an explanation for why it exists. It was built in a factory or built by a group of people, designed and blah, blah, blah. So, but the same thing applies when we have a group of 10 cameras. That group of 10 cameras has an explanation. Maybe they were built in different factories. Maybe they were all built in the same factory and they're just sitting in the warehouse of that factory. So when it comes to explanation, we can see that in going from parts to wholes is completely legitimate when it comes to explanation. Now, it might not be the case with weight, right? But that's different. So fallacy composition is not something that you can just like throw out and think that it just demolishes everything. So that's one thing to say is actually you can use the fallacy composition to bolster the argument and give another reason to think that premise one is true. But another thing to say is that most defenses of the first premise, which is the explanatory premise, which says that for anything that is contingent or any group of things that is contingent, there's an explanation for that thing or that group. Most defenses of that premise don't involve parts to whole reasoning. It just doesn't go there. Usually we're talking about, we're making some kind of common sense intuition based on the fact that everything that we know of follows that rule, follows that principle. We're looking at something like an inductive generalization. Inductive generalization is basically inferring that from your limited experience. I'll give an example. So with gravity, everywhere that we go on the Earth where we live, gravity works the same everywhere. And so we can make an inductive generalization to say that in our experience, gravity works everywhere. So probably everywhere in the universe, gravity works the same. That's it. That's called an inductive generalization. Yeah. So it's generalizing based on our inductive experience. So that's another way that people defend the first premise, is that everything in our experience has an explanation. So it's pretty safe to assume that everything or every contingent thing has an explanation. So that's the second way that is normally defended. And a third way that I really, really like is the argument from chaos, which is super interesting. And basically, I don't really even see a way out of this at all. And the argument from chaos basically says that if some contingent thing can exist without an explanation, then the first thing we want to ask is how many of those things could exist? And if there's one thing in the set of all possible things that could exist, every contingent thing that could exist without an explanation, slow me down if I'm not making sense here. But basically the point is that if we grant that one contingent thing can exist for no reason, then we've also got to admit there's no reason to limit that number of things. So it has to be infinite. There's got to be an infinite number of contingent things that have no explanation. There's no reason to cut it off at one thing or two things, basically. But if that's the case, then the world should just be sort of chaotic, like a chaotic soup of just things popping in and out of existence all the time. If there's an infinite number of things that can come into being or start to exist for no reason at all, there's no reason why things shouldn't just be popping into being all over the place.
Yeah, and even if you say randomly for whatever, only mugs are contingent things that aren't depending on something else, well then why not if they're just infinite mugs all popping into us and going crazy?
Right, exactly. And yeah, so, but those are the three ways that I know of, and that's the way that I defend it. And there's other arguments for actually the first premise. But notice, going back to the fallacy of composition, notice that none of those reason from parts to wholes, or use any kind of reasoning like that. So when someone argues or presents this objection, they're probably not listening carefully enough, or they might not know that this actually supports the argument and is another way of establishing that the first premise is true inadvertently. So
yeah. That's funny you say that, because I was thinking like Cosmic Skeptic's own objection kind of bolsters the argument, because if he's going to say like every sheep in the herd has a mother, therefore the entire sheep has a mother, is fallacious. But of course you couldn't reason that just because every given sheep doesn't have the same mother, that therefore the group isn't somehow contingent on a group of parents. No, it's still contingent. The entire group is still contingent on parents. So it really doesn't help his argument out to point that out.
Well, if we make it more generic, so instead of saying every sheep has a mother, we could just say every sheep has an explanation.
Right.
And then obviously it still follows that the group of sheep have an explanation.
Yeah.
So as long as we make it generic enough, when we're talking about explanation, it's fine.
Yeah.
So
I think
if we limit it to having like the same explanation, then obviously that doesn't work. But when it comes to having just some explanation that goes through, it works fine.
Yeah. I would encourage everybody, if anybody's ever being faced or challenged with the fallacy of composition, just ask the fundamental question: are the right building blocks in the individual pieces to build what's going to be in the result? And that's how you can run you through that and determine it. So this has been a lot of fun. We are actually going to go to a web extended real quick, because I'm an avid defender of the moral argument. I think it might be slightly higher on the totem pole, but I'm willing to be convinced if the contingency is higher on there. You and I are going to get into that on web extended. Everybody, if you want to see that, you're going to have to head on over to subscribestar.com/TUA. You can see all my other ones there with Trent Doherty, Braxton Hunter, and so on. So the YouTube channel, Capturing Christianity, Facebook page, same thing. Website, capturingchristianity.com, Twitter, Capturing Christ, and then patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. Is there anything I'm missing there?
No, I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, we're also on Instagram, Instagram.com/Capturing Christianity.
I always forget. I am not active on Instagram. I'm a little bit, but not really.
I'm not either.
I don't even have the app on my phone anymore. So.
Yeah. Well.
But anyway, thank you so much for doing this, brother, and we'll get you back on soon. Alright, everybody, we're going to see you on the other side of this.